There's a lot of misinformation out there in the world. The brain is basically a pattern recognition system. It's taking in inputs from within the body and from the world.
I came across several papers that you have published. You have spoken about the intuitive intelligence, self-regulation, and lifting consciousness.
So the brain wants a match between a familiar and the current to feel comfortable. What the amygdala is really all about is determining what is familiar and what is not familiar. Different parts of the amygdala are doing that from within the body, what we call interoception. The heart sends far more neural information to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. The heart rhythmic patterns are one of the best measures of current emotional state. Here's the thing. A lot of people have established worry, anxiety, or frustration, fear as a baseline.
Does it mean that people get addicted to suffering then?
I wouldn't use the word addicted, but yes, because it's the familiar. It's our belief systems that we've been programmed through childhood and so on that become our familiar worldviews and the way we see the world. The baseline is the rhythms of the heart that the amygdala is seen often, that we repeat. If we're lifting consciousness, that critical that we create a new baseline of what we would call a more coherent, more connected, getting the heart and brain more in sync and synchronized.
What is the impact of that baseline in establishing my connection with my own self?
So a lot of what we're talking about in terms of baseline is unconscious. We aren't conscious that this process is going on, and it's keeping us stuck. You could say it really blocks our capacity to connect with who we really are.
Hey, Rollin, such a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much.
Well, it's great to be here. I've enjoyed meeting you and getting to know you.
Always, and I've been following the kind of work Heart Math Institute is doing worldwide. I think it is making a significant difference in the world, the way people relate with each other, the way we can lift humanity and consciousness together. So thank you for holding this space.
My pleasure.
Rollin, I've been doing my own research and I've been doing my own homework, and that's where I came across several papers that you have published. In this paper that you have spoken about, the intuitive intelligence, self-regulation, and lifting consciousness, I was trying to understand what it means. It says, without establishing a new baseline reference of self-regulation that incorporates intuitive perspectives, people are at risk of living their lives through automatic filters of past familiar experience. I think I can learn about this one statement itself for the next 40 minutes. I'll be digging deeper into what is intuition, how can we self-regulate, how can we uplift our consciousness. So let's start from the baseline reference.
Wow, okay. Yeah, we're jumping right in on a little bit of a deeper topic, but I think it's a really, really important one because we all have what you could think of as a baseline. And this is deeper from a neurophysiological perspective than habits. That would be a close association to what I'm talking about. Let's talk about what the brain does.
Okay.
Functionally, right? And the brain is basically a pattern recognition system. It's taking in inputs from within the body and from the world, what we see, hear, smell, touch, etc., and recreating within the brain our picture of the world, which actually isn't the way the world really is, as we know.
What we call as the worldview, my worldview, your worldview. Okay.
Right, but that's what the brain is really doing. It's pattern recognition and storage and so on. Ultimately, when you really get down to the basic functions of what it's doing, what we're really talking about is what the amygdalas do. So the amygdalas are well established to be involved in emotional experience. Right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of misinformation out there in the world, like the amygdalas are the fear center. Well, that's nonsense. That's not true. What the amygdala is really all about is determining what is familiar and what is not familiar.
What is not,
Familiar, not familiar.
Yeah.
Different part, right? So different parts of the amygdala are doing that from within the body, what we call interoception, right? The rhythms of the heart and go directly to the amygdala, for example. Breathing rhythms, all these types of things in body's internal sensory systems. Then a different part of the amygdala is also doing that, determining familiar, not familiar, from all the sensory systems we have for sensing and recreating our view of the world, the outside world. Now, to do that, familiar, not familiar, it
Mm,
has to be able to compare current inputs, what's happening now,
mm,
to a reference.
mm.
Is it familiar to the references or not?
Yeah. It's like going back to the library. Do I have this book? Yes. The reference says yes.
Yeah.
Come back and say
And
it's familiar.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's and as we mature and as we go through life, we build more and more familiar
Yeah.
references, right?
References. Yeah.
And so the brain wants a match between
Mm,
a familiar and the current to feel comfortable.
mm.
Now, I can give you a few examples of this. Let's start with the external world. So for some people, let's say they live in a city and they go to the quiet countryside for a vacation. The quiet and the peace is unfamiliar.
Mm,
I don't know if you've ever
mm.
had this experience or not.
Yeah.
It's hard to sleep. It's too quiet. This sounds crazy, but it's true. Whereas somebody who, like me, I live in the mountains here in California, and it's a very beautiful, peaceful, quiet
Mm,
thing. I go to the large cities and it drives me crazy. It's
mm,
not familiar.
mm,
There was a time in my life when I lived by railroad tracks
mm.
when I was much younger. The train for the first few weeks, then after a while, I didn't even hear it anymore. It
Yeah.
had become familiar and filtered out, right?
Mm. Just to add to the what you're talking about, and because a large portion of our audience is from India as well. I remember the first time in the initial part of my career when I visited Lucknow, and Indians would be able to relate to that. I found Lucknow quite calm and peaceful and slow as compared to what happens in New Delhi. So I'm with you on that, Rollin. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that we adapt to new familiars and things over
Yeah.
time. This is the way a healthy function is working. Now, let's take it to the internal sensory systems. So
Mm,
I think just to give a little bit of background here, it's important to know that the heart, through our nervous system, the heart sends far more neural information to the brain than the brain sends to the heart.
okay.
And the heart is the primary source of rhythmic activity in the body. It's the only true
Mhm.
pacemaker system in the body. But that's a whole other, I don't want to get too deep into that to
Yeah.
talk about the familiarity. So these nerves go directly, well, to all parts of the brain, but specifically to the amygdalas. What forms a baseline, in this case, is the rhythms of the heart that the amygdala is seen often, that we repeat.
Mm,
And the heart rhythmic patterns are one of the best measures of current emotional state. So,
mm,
for example, we can look at just the rhythmic pattern of the heart. It's called heart rate variability. And so anxiety looks different than frustration and different than impatience. And
mm,
of course, a radically different pattern than things like
mm,
when we feel kindness and
mm,
compassion and
mm,
love and
mm,
appreciation and so on.
mm.
So I'll give you maybe a story here that an example might help ground this for some people
Yeah.
listening. So when I was a little kid, we'd go visit one of my grandmothers, and
Mm,
this particular grandmother drove us nuts. She
mm,
just, with her worry, always worried. Don't climb the tree,
mm,
you'll fall and break your arm,
mm,
and on and
mm.
on and on, always worrying about us. And so what I now understand is that she had, in her life, anxiety, worry, and that had been appropriate through certain phases, but that had become her baseline,
Ah,
the familiar.
wow.
So
Okay.
what her brain was doing everything it could to create the match to feel
Mm,
comfortable. So worry becomes the baseline.
okay.
Right. Now this is true for, I'm just picking on worry here, but everything we experience goes through this process. And so she couldn't help it. Right. That was self-generating. Now, this is just kind of a high level example, but by the way, the same grandmother, whenever we would come over to visit, she would always have she was an awesome baker and would have these hot, fresh chocolate chip cookies ready for us. And of course, they were great. And so I still to this day have a familiar reference to chocolate chip cookies that unconsciously has
Mm.
that really good feeling.
So my inference here is, Roland, let's say there are two people who are coming together with different baselines. One's baseline is, as you mentioned, worry and anxiety and jealousy and hurt. That's the basic
Yeah.
baseline. And the other person is operating from a space of joy,
Yeah.
happiness,
Right. There's
happy
a
go
mismatch.
lucky. So, how does that work?
Well, there can be a mismatch between those two individuals, maybe not
Okay.
really resonating with each other,
Yeah.
But so let me give you another example. A fish that's in a polluted or dirty river or lake. They have no idea of that.
Mm, mm,
That's their familiar, right?
mm,
And they wouldn't know until they maybe get plucked out and popped in a fresh lake with fresh, clean water.
mm. So would they survive that? That's a question.
I'm
In the
sorry,
fresh
what?
water. In the fresh water, would they survive?
Well, it would become, at first it'd be very unfamiliar to the fish, but after a while it'd be, a new experience. We actually
Yeah.
don't experience
Mm.
stress. And by stress, I mean, it's the inner dialogues, it's our emotions, it's maybe the mental and emotional turmoil that we're
Yeah.
experiencing. It becomes familiar and normal.
Yeah. And so that would it be okay for me to say that it's like water to fish, right? The fish would never get to know that the fish is swimming in a polluted, toxic water. Similarly, a person with a baseline of worry and anxiety and jealousy and hurt would never get to know the ocean, the
Exactly.
toxicity
Yeah.
the person is swimming into.
Right. Exactly. Unless they have a new experience. Right. Now, here's the thing for a lot of people, but let's say that have established, say, worry, anxiety, or it could be frustration, fear, whatever, as a baseline, right? When they start to practice some of, say, like the heart math approaches and techniques, which are starting to shift us into a higher or a more comfortable, well, that's the wrong word here, but a new experience. At first, it's very uncomfortable because it's not familiar.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a process that we have to go through.
So, Rollin, let me ask you this question. Does it mean that people get addicted to suffering then?
Well, I wouldn't use the word addicted, but yes, because it's the familiar. So, we could actually argue that what you could think of as 3D consciousness is, on a mass scale, is exactly that. It's our belief systems that we've been programmed through childhood and so on that become our familiar worldviews and the way we see the world. Now, there's a couple really important things here, and that is that, first of all, you cannot think yourself into a new baseline, not directly. What one of my mentors, a very famous neuroscientist, Dr. Carl Pribram, proved is that the only way to establish or change a baseline reference that we're always comparing the now to is to change the activity from the heart to the brain, to the amygdalas. And do
by
that
changing the
enough
rhythmic pattern.
Yeah, that it becomes, over time, forms a new baseline.
Yeah.
And this is also why people don't like change. Right? Most people, unless we have a baseline that where change is, become our familiar, and which is rare, but there are some people like that. But that's because that's their baseline.
Yeah. I'm not surprised with what you're saying, Rollin, because, let's try and understand that. I didn't know the word baseline, right? I'm just looking at from my practical experiences. People know that worrying and anxiety is not good for health. They understand that at the cognitive level, and yet they find it very difficult to put it into practice because, as you mentioned, that the heart sends more neural signals to brain than the other way around. So if there is something here and that signals are low in number, which is going to the heart, on the opposite, the baseline is higher here. So the number of neural signals are going to the brain is more, then of course, more is going to overpower the less neural signals. I mean, that's what I'm understanding. I could be wrong as well.
Well, it's kind of a metaphor for what I'm saying, but it works.
Metaphorical.
But it works. Right. So I'm just trying to give some crude examples here of what baselines are, and hopefully that people understand this. So if we're lifting consciousness, that it's critical that we create a new baseline of what we would call a more coherent, more connected, getting the heart and brain more in sync and synchronized.
Let's start from here. What is the impact of lower baseline in establishing connection with yourself? Forget about others. Let's start with self. If I've got a baseline that's always surrounded with worry and anxiety and jealousy and hurt and comparison and me versus you and has judgments, right? Or, those heavy emotions. What is the impact of that baseline in establishing my connection with my own self?
Yeah, it's you could say it's really blocks our capacity to connect with who we really are. So this kind of gets into maybe self-awareness. And self-awareness has levels, right? So there's kind of basic and self-awareness is kind of the precursor to being able to self-regulate. You can think of it as self-leadership, right? To be in charge of ourselves, these types of things. So the kind of a first level, we start becoming aware of what are we really feeling that's unconscious. So a lot of what we're talking about in terms of baseline is unconscious. We aren't conscious that this process is going on, and that it's keeping us stuck in a certain kind of rut or boxed into a certain worldview or a belief system, even about consciousness and about ourselves and human capabilities. This is why this is so important. Level one would be becoming more aware, starting to bring the unconscious conscious, kind of aware of what am I really feeling? Because like somebody who's, you said it well, somebody who's with anxiety all the time or worry loops, that has become so familiar, we actually aren't even aware of it anymore, right? Because it's so familiar and comfortable. So that would be kind of a basic, step one of becoming more self-aware, and then more self-regulated, ability to manage our own emotional diet, if you want to say it. It's turning around certain patterns and loops and so on. But then as we grow and become capable there, we start becoming more coherent in a way. What we mean by that, physiologically speaking, things become more in sync. Then maybe start becoming more aware of others, and the energetic interactions with others. And then that goes to another level of more self-awareness of who we actually really are. Now this kind of switches into another discussion. But when I'm suggesting if we go a little bit deeper into our work, I'm suggesting that we are really multidimensional beings, living systems. That we have certainly the physical stuff, right? We can put under microscopes and things that you can't put, for example, a thought or an emotion or an intuition, right? Or an inner experience under a microscope. These actually exist in another kind of level of our dimensionality. What you could think of as an energetic environment, space or environment.
Rollin, you have already introduced two beautiful words here: multi-dimensional beings and intuition. Before we get on to that, in your experience, what have you been able to gauge that if today, right now, if I were to look at what is my baseline reference, how can I get to know that? That's one. Second, what are the symptoms that you've been able to gauge from different people that if you have got these kind of symptoms, the chances are very high that you have got this kind of baseline? So if you can just help us understand that.
Well, I mean, often, the insights into what our personal baselines are people giving us feedback, friends who would kind of tell us, but they also have their baselines kind of in my world. Okay. So I'm following our research and our data. It has taken us into some areas that would kind of cross and challenge the traditional materialistic worldview.
Very important.
Right. And I have friends and colleagues that are so steeped in that worldview that anything outside of it is like, don't confuse me with the data. My mind's made up. Is that making sense? It's just too outside their worldview. They can't accept. It's not familiar.
So they are so much stuck with their own belief system that they're not even willing to look at any other perspective.
Well, exactly. Okay. And this plays out in so many ways in our educational system, in our political systems, in our leadership, businesses, and the world is changing, right? But people are stuck in their old belief systems, which are basically a type of baseline.
I'm just wondering, I'm just getting more concerned because it could be really destructive. In today's world,
look at the world.
Absolutely. If I look at Indian political system, what's happening is that my political party is better than your political party, not because of what was the reason that this political party came into existence. We forget that. I think that's the reason why religions, when they come together, they fight with each other. When spirituality comes in the true essence, they collaborate.
Right. Yeah.
right?
Well, yeah. So familiar. So so the same concepts there's also what we have are called social baselines,
Mm.
right? So
Yeah.
we were talking about, but these are also very real. And the brain is automatically calculating,
Mm.
or say our social network, and unconsciously, and this is, it results in things like load sharing. Do I have other people I can count on to get certain things done?
Mm.
This is all unconscious, right?
Mm. Mm.
Let me tell you, we're kind of shifting into gears a little bit here, but
Mm.
on social baselines, let me
Yeah.
give you a really fascinating study that I think there's a lot more to it, but it usually gives a good essence. And these are studies
Yeah.
that were done
Mm.
where you have a person standing at a hill, basically. It can either be the real hill or something that you're doing in a simulated
Mhm.
way. It doesn't matter.
Mhm.
And you have a device that you put your hand in, and the task is to match your hand with the slope of the hill, right?
Mhm.
And you can look, is there a match or a mismatch? Can you get, most
Yeah.
people, with the intent that you're going to have to climb the hill, right?
Yeah.
So most people will overestimate the steepness of the hill.
Okay.
Okay, first thing. Now, if you put a backpack on that person,
Mhm.
and then you start putting rocks or weights in doing this exercise, what happens is the perception of the steepness of the hill goes up,
Goes up. Yeah.
almost in a linear relationship with the amount of weight you've added to the
Mhm.
person's backpack. Okay, so yeah, we're
Hmm.
unconsciously calculating the energy, right? So it's
Yeah.
modulating our perception. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. If you put a friend next to him,
Hmm.
we're going to climb the hill together. Guess what happens? The perception of the slope, the slant of the hill goes down.
Hmm.
And it's almost again, a linear relationship with a degree of connection with that friend. If
Wow.
somebody you know well and trust well, you have a bigger shift in perception
Hmm.
than if it's a stranger. Okay. So what this is telling us, very good, important data that is showing us that the quality of our relationships and our friendships is literally modulating how we perceive the world.
Hmm. And metaphorically, the example that you shared, that if I'm carrying loads and rocks in my bag, the steepness of the hill that I'm climbing on appears more steeper, probably because if I'm carrying my own baggage and my own past biases, life would appear difficult. Not because
Right.
life is difficult, but because I'm carrying so much of baggage from the past and not being able to carry it
Well,
smoothly.
exactly. And if we are separated from others, because
Yeah.
of our own anxieties and stresses, then
Mm,
it's increasing that inner unconscious load that we're always
mm.
calculating. It's a little bit off track of the original question, but it's an example of how
No, it's a very
baseline.
important point we are getting onto, Rollin. Help me understand. Why does it happen, if there's a research that has been gone into this, that when I'm operating from a space of separatedness, metaphorically, if I'm carrying rocks in my bag,
Mhm.
where is this tendency to blame the world come from? It's very easy to say, hey, this person has been wrong. This person is not showing up in the way they should. They should be showing up in the working environment. This person is not behaving properly. People start to question the psychological safety in the environment. Where does that come from? And what could be done to support these kind of people?
Yeah, well, it also comes from the same discussion we've been having about baselines.
Hmm.
That becomes our worldview, and that's, if you're thinking about the evolution of consciousness, that is kind of a lower level of consciousness, and as we become more self-aware of who we really are, right, then those perceptions start to change, and we start to understand that what's happening in the external world, right, is the stress aura, you can call it, or the thing out there, but what we have control over is how we react and perceive and handle the external situation.
Hmm.
And I would say, as one of the benefits, as biggest benefits, as we become more connected to our own higher dimensionality, through what I would say through the heart, literally the energetic heart, then we start becoming more connected with the flow of information from and you can call this your higher self,
Hmm.
or we call it your larger self, but
Hmm.
it's part of our wholeness. We're a
Yeah.
system of that multidimensionality I was talking about. some people would refer to it as more connected with their spirit or their soul.
Yeah.
Whatever, it doesn't matter what your inner reference to that is, but it's a source of intelligence and information. It's an intuitive information. Once we connect more with that, we're starting to unfold who we really are as a multidimensional being. And then we start having the confidence to know that we can handle whatever comes our way. So then that rises, then the vibration consciousness increases, and it allows us to be more, to rise above the things like the anxieties and the worries and the fears and the perceptions of separation. And we become more aware that we really are energetically interconnected with others and even the earth itself. But I just want to make one, but it's not just a concept, it becomes knowledge, knowing.
Oh, absolutely.
Because of experience. Otherwise, it's.
Yeah. Otherwise, with knowledge, I don't think that we'll be able to handle that. Rollin, most of the audience for this podcast, they are C-suite executives, they are like senior leaders managing teams, and they are executive coaches. Now, I personally believe that if somebody's operating from a baseline of hurt, jealousy, where the person does not experience psychological safety, I think it's the responsibility of the leader as well to provide that psychological safety.
Absolutely.
Because it's like fish to water.
You talk about psychological safety in a leadership, or let's say a leadership team or any work team. It doesn't really matter. Some of the in the business context, the best research that I know of on this was done at Google. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not.
Aristotle Project?
Yes, you're familiar with it.
Tell me, would love to hear from you.
Well, I mean, you already know it. It was really neat research because they spent a lot of money and a lot of time really looking into team performance. And as it turned out, I won't go through all the details because you're already aware of it, it sounds like. None of the things that they thought would predict team performance ended up being what predicted team performance. And it didn't matter if they were a bunch of smart people together. In fact, that was one of the worst things you could do, was put a bunch of, PhDs together in the same team without other types of people. It didn't matter if they were virtual, in person, how long they had been with the company or the team. None of that stuff that they thought would predict it mattered. What actually did was psychological safety, what they ended up calling psychological safety that you're referring to. And the essence of that was that all of the team members feel safe to express their opinions and perspectives without fear of reprisal. And then the second factor was that it didn't have to all be in the same meeting, but at the end of the day or end of the week, whatever, that all the team members had equal time or equal voices is probably a better way to say it, within a decision or within an issue that was going on. So everybody's perspectives, which can be very different across team members, was honored and heard and respected.
Here is my confusion. Now let's try and understand that. Here is an environment which is open, that's one. Here's this person with the baseline of worry and anxiety and jealousy and a hurt. The possibility is very high, the person would not feel very safe.
Right.
Or I'm saying, if the environment is like that, where the person with the higher baseline would not experience psychological safety, there's something in the culture of the organization. Now, if the person is not experiencing psychologically safe, where would you begin? Is it the baseline, the person is not there yet, or there's something in the environment or the culture which is not supporting?
Yeah, well, with this, you ask really good questions, and these are complex things that you're bringing up. But maybe to simplify it, let's say that you have a team, and it's the individuals who make up that team. We can kind of look at them like cells within a higher organism.
Yeah, precisely.
As an analogy here. So if you have enough team members with say a maladapted baseline, you know, anxiety or over ambition or those kinds of things, then if you have enough team members that way, you've got a dysfunctional team. There will be very low psychological safety. You might still get things done because every team exists to do something, to get something done.
But it's not fun to work in that team.
It's not fun, and it doesn't mean that they couldn't perform at a much better, higher level than they are. Now, if there's enough of those team members who do have a higher level of maturity,
Mm.
let's say, and more personal coherence would be my
Mm.
language, then that can help elevate, if you will, the other team members who aren't there yet. They can kind of come into that field and into that experience and start to, over time, adapt and kind of shift their baselines, becoming more like the other people, the higher coherent people within the team. Now, this also interacts with culture,
Mm.
right? Because if you could think of a culture of a work team or a company or even a country
Mm.
as a
Precisely.
baseline.
Precisely.
That is really molding unconsciously their worldviews and their beliefs. And
Mm.
that can be also very limiting
Mm.
or not, right? Depending upon that.
So you spoke about human beings are multi-dimensional being. Tell me more about that. What does that mean?
A multidimensional being.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Let's start with just the complexity. And this brings in our concepts of coherence, by the
Yeah.
way, of any living system, but especially a human being.
Mm.
So somewhere, we're made of the same stuff that my desk is made out of,
Mm.
right? So somehow particles have to kind of spin together to become
Mm.
atoms, and atoms have to group together to become molecules, and molecules
Mm-hmm.
have to form to become basically organs, and organs have to work together to create a functional living system.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and in fact, the amount of, and over time, those things have to cohere together and be stable.
Mm.
Right. I mean, it's complexity of any living system. And in
Yeah.
fact, one of my friends who's now passed away, Wan Ho, actually proved she was the first to define living systems versus non-living systems as quantum coherence,
Mm.
which means basically that the coherence that has to happen across all these levels of scale I just talked about and across
Mm-hmm.
time, it's incredibly complex. Two-thirds of the known 72 octaves of the electromagnetic spectrum have to cohere, come together, and work together in a coherent way.
For a living
So,
being.
yeah, to make any living system, let
Yeah.
alone a human being.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, in humans, we can take that to the next level, social connection.
Mm.
So now here we are, individual beings that have to somehow work together socially to survive and grow and become,
Mm-hmm.
modern society.
Mm.
There has to be a coherence we have to get along with each other,
Mm.
right? Anything done. Because obviously, kind of, the infighting and the in-group, out-group, which is unfortunately becoming more prevalent in society
Mm.
than it was in the past, to a certain degree. But there's always been a nature to kind of fight the other, like
Mm.
like you said, in religions, we don't like each other, even though we have the
Mm.
same belief in the same, whatever God or whatever. It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the next evolutionary step, I think, in human consciousness
Mm.
is coming into coherence at that level. I know this
Mm.
isn't really answering your question exactly, but I think we had to kind of give some basics.
It's definitely opening up different dimensions of what make a human being. The dimension of consciousness, of course, we have spoken about the dimension of physicality. We have
Right.
spoken about the dimension of emotions and intuition. That's what I'm gauging out of this conversation.
So I know where I lost my thread to answer your question. So, okay, so let's just take those scales I was just talking about.
Yeah.
Coherence is a term we use to describe the behavior of the parts of a complex system. How
Mm-hmm.
well are they working together, right? So we can talk about that in terms of heart-brain coherence,
Yeah.
is the harmonious activity of the hormonal and the immune and the neural systems all working together to create, our experience
Mm.
of life and our level of consciousness ultimately. But for the parts to work together, there has to be a communication
Mm.
amongst the parts. It's not magic. There has to be some type of communication.
Mm.
Right. So that, on one level, like this would be the materialistic worldview. That's all, hormones are lock and key and da 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 da, and billiard balls bouncing off each other and stuff. But
Yeah.
we know that can't. It's been so proven now that cannot explain
Yeah.
that alone any living system. So there are clearly, they're like chemical communicators, but that's just one level. there has to be energetic, or call it electromagnetic, and quantum level. And I don't mean quantum in quantum physics here, but of a type of connection and communication amongst the parts of me and you to cohere together to be a stable living system. So right there is multidimensional, right? At one level, but then there's also what I'm suggesting at another energetic level, who we really are, would be what people would, here at HeartMath, we just call it your larger self. Right? Whether you want to call that your higher self. I mean, who do you talk to when you go to your deeper heart, and have a conversation with your, that deeper part of yourself?
What a beautiful question it is. You said,
yeah.
What a beautiful question you're asking. Who do I speak to when I go deep within to my higher self?
Yeah. So that is, I'm suggesting that's not some external being or thing. It's actually you, just at a higher dimensional aspect of your wholeness, of your undivided wholeness.
Would you call that intuition?
Absolutely. That's the real intuition that I'm talking about. It is, so to me, the intuition that elevates consciousness, and it's also very practical in day-to-day life when we're making choices and decisions about what to eat, who to be with, business decisions. It's really that flow of information from our larger self, which actually comes down through the energetic heart, and the energetic heart talks to all the DNA and all the cells. That's where the information that coheres us together exists, right? And then into our consciousness, and that's something we can learn to more deeply access and follow that inner guidance. This reminds me of I don't know why, intuition, I guess, being guiding me here. We did a lot of lab-based research on not what I called non-local intuition many years ago. The paper you're referring to, kind of reviewed some of that. So when we published that, well, first of all, what we found is the heart's the first to get the signal from a future event in this case, and then sends a measurably different signal to the brain, and then you have a body response, and then the intuitive feeling. That's one level of this. But anyway, after we published that, I was contacted by the dean of the School of Entrepreneurship in Australia, who told me that we've been studying entrepreneurs, these cohorts or groups of what he calls serial or repeat entrepreneurs for many years, and they have groups at MIT and Cambridge and these groups around the world that they've been working with, and of course, what makes us a good repeat or serial entrepreneur, the guys that do it many times, right? I mean, examples of that. He said the number one common characteristic amongst these characters, is what he called them from Australia. He said it's very clear. It's that 80% of these groups, from whatever part of the world they're from, is that they rely on their intuition when making the final decision. Of course, they look at the financials and the balance sheets, but when the rubber meets the road, they rely on their intuition to make the decision. 80%, most common characteristic across all of them. So the second most common characteristic is that when they're successful, they have a sense of wanting to give back to those who help them be successful, and the community, and ultimately the world at large, many of them.
Wow.
So that was the second. I was once asked, at a conference I was speaking at, is there any place for intuition in business? So that's why I like to tell this story, because obviously there is. So anyway, they wanted to do a study using our methods to measure intuition with repeat entrepreneurs and like accountants and risk averse, the risk averse types, to see if we could measure a difference. We actually ultimately ended up being able to do that, but that's a whole other story.
I'm not surprised, Rollin. I think it's a validation of what I've heard in the past as well from my interaction with few of the very senior leaders in India. I mean, leaders who have led multi-billion-dollar companies in the country. So I've had the great privilege of interacting with Mr. T.V. Narendran from Tata Steel. I had the great privilege of interviewing Mr. Shiva Kumar, who has led Nokia in India, Mr. Manoj Kohli, who has led Airtel in India. And one of those questions, one of the common threads that they have spoken about is definitely that when they are stuck, there's a higher voice that guides them, and there's a deep desire to contribute. So the 2 points that you're speaking about, I've heard in the past as well. Now, one of the questions that I've been struggling with, Rollin, and I don't have an answer. How would you know that the voice of your higher self and your intuition? What if it's coming from your past fears? What if it's coming from your baseline, which is wrapped up?
The mind. Yeah.
The mind, right? Which could be your egoic identity.
Yeah, right.
That might be coming from your past traumas.
Yeah. Well, that's all. I'm going to put all of that in the mind, right? It's all the baselines, the histories that form these mental moral baselines. And our upbringing and our cultures, which all help form baselines.
Yeah, you have got parental trauma, you have got societal trauma. You may call it, hey, that's my intuition.
You're asking the right question, and it's a really deep question, because I think when we talked before, I might have asked you, I'm going to do it here, a question of maybe even recently, past few days, week, certainly month, if there had been a time or an experience where you were maybe asked to do something, or you had the mind came up with a desire or an ambition. I want to buy a new car, or I want to, whatever that is. But you had a deeper inner feeling, a deeper sense that may not be the right decision.
Of course, I've had experience.
Of course, we all
have experienced, right?
Yeah. So I'm just using, I can use science language here, but I'm going to keep it simple. Mind, heart.
Okay.
Right. Or deeper intuition, mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what I'm suggesting here, what our research, I'd say, strongly supports, is that it is that very lack of alignment that you're talking about, or lack of understanding the difference, that is the largest source of stress and disharmony in our personal lives and socially in the planetary scale in the world. So how do we know the difference between, well, first of all, for a lot of people out there, they don't even know that we have a larger self that we can talk to, that we can consult with. Don't even know it exists, because it's been trained into, it's all about the mind. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with the brain and the mind. I want one, and I want it to work really well. Yeah. Right. It just needs a new operating system. Right. Which is what gets downloaded. You can think of as a download, an upgrade, when we do start accessing and aligning, literally aligning with, energetically, measurably with the heart and the higher dimensions of the heart, we'll call it. So it takes practice, and having techniques that allow us to shift our physiology, the rhythms of the heart, into what we call a coherent state, is a wonderful first step, because that starts to quieten the mental emotional noise that in the loops that are going on in the brain mind system. That quiet, and this is what meditation has really always been about. Right, is trying to settle the system down, set still, quiet, and kind of an inner quietness.
It's like regulating your heart rhythms.
Well, that's in a more advanced
one part of it. Yeah.
Okay. There are some systems that have known this and are onto this, like Heartfulness there in India is a wonderful perspective on this as well. And then there are other systems that are all about the brain and the mind and, the pineal gland and, which are more disassociative and really kind of, in some ways, are actually counterindicated. They actually block us from hearing the deeper voice, our inner voice. But anyway, so getting into a coherent heart state helps quieten, but it's also measurably, we've proved this in research, opening that channel between the heart and the brain, the frontal cortex of the brain, so that the intuitive signals from our larger self, from the heart, have a way of being heard. And then I'd say the last step, and this can be challenging, is having the courage to follow through on once we start to know the deeper inner voice. And it can take some practice, because the mind, one of our founder, Doc Childrey, said something a few months ago that I tracked me up, but I think it's true. So true. He says the mind doesn't like to lose customers.
Yeah. Of course, because that's a
it's
very
had its way.
unknown.
It's had its way. It is the baseline. It's mind-based intelligence.
It's a baseline. It's an unfamiliar territory. And I'm very comfortable in my comfortable zone. And I would not want to get out of that, because, as I said, suffering, addiction might not be the right word, but I would want to explore in the familiar territory.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it's the same thing for the evolution of consciousness, because the familiar way, our belief systems, And it's such a huge limiting factor
Mm,
for, I'm going to say, humanity at large, because once we do access the higher dimensions of who we really are,
mm,
it's really the mind is the big winner, but it takes it finally being able to surrender to the higher intelligence, and then it becomes in aligned with, and it's life changes to a much happier, more successful
mm,
way. And we start having that confidence I was talking about earlier, that we know we can handle whatever comes our way. But it first, it helps lift us above the normal 3D level of consciousness.
mm.
It doesn't mean that everybody's necessarily going to be rich and
Yeah,
wealthy. That may not be
yeah.
our blueprint, or
Mm,
what we're really meant to do this life, right?
mm. Is there any direct connection between um, a baseline, which is embedded into joy, peace, connection, stillness, ease, and
Yeah, I would
accomplishment and
say,
success as
yeah, I would
defined by
say
society?
absolutely. Yeah,
Mm,
absolutely. And that doesn't mean all the millionaire billionaires are this way, but I mean that goes back to just the basic emotional intelligence work that was
mm,
done in the 80s. That and there's people we know in our lives. Maybe it's another way of saying this, um, that they're just composed and they're
mm,
kind, and we know we can count on them to give us good advice, right? You know what I'm
mm.
trying to say here? That
Yeah,
just have that
yeah.
ability to
There are few
internally move.
names, there are few faces which are just flashing in front of me, Rollin.
Yeah, so they have that other baseline we're talking about,
Mm.
and we all grow through. I mean, really being here, from my perspective, it just really is about the evolution of consciousness.
Do we all grow, or does
I'm
it
sure we
require
do.
huge amount of effort?
Well, the evolution of our own consciousness does require some effort, typically.
Mm. Yeah.
And I certainly can't prove this as a scientist, but my own inner experience,
Mm.
is because that the Earth is a really cool place to be able to come to,
Mhm.
um, and experience emotions, and a deep, well, it's a more dense system from a universal perspective that you
Mm.
get to come to, and it takes many lifetimes. So I believe that to evolve in consciousness, to wake up to who we really are in
Mm.
this level of density of Earth, um, which is
Mm.
an awesome kind of gift
Absolutely.
from your larger soul perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Roland, you have been referring to heart very often. I personally believe that heart is a organ that pumps blood.
Mhm.
What are you referring to when you're talking about heart? Is it like the organ
Well,
called heart, or?
both. I mean, we
Mm.
publish. I'm published in the American Journal of Cardiology and
Mm.
many high-end cardiology journals, right?
Yeah.
So at that level, we're talking about the physical heart, and yes, the heart maybe pumps blood. That's even questionable that it's actually pumping more than it's regulating blood and
Mm.
rhythm, but that's a whole other topic. But so yes, there's the physical heart, and the physical heart we now know has its own brain called the intrinsic cardiac nervous system that has memory and short and long-term memory and all these things that are kind of revolutionizing even the physical aspects of understanding what
Mm.
heart is. And the heart has a mind of its own. It makes its
Mm.
own decisions, physically talking about. What I'm also suggesting is that we have a second heart that we call the energetic heart. It's been
Mm.
I'm not the inventor of that term, but it's been called the spiritual heart in many kind of philosophical and religious traditions for thousands of years.
Mm.
Right? And in fact, it's the most common um, connection between all the world's great religions, is this idea of heart, or the spiritual heart or energetic heart, being the access to our larger self.
Yeah.
To soul, to wisdom, to information. And this
Yeah.
is in all of our language. I'm sure in India, probably even
Yeah.
more in some
No, we
places.
talk about heart-based living.
Yeah, right.
We do talk about heart-based living. Yeah.
Right. So what our research and and my own experience and many others, and more people are waking up and discovering this within their own experience these
Mm.
days, is I'm just saying the energetic heart is real.
Mm.
It's not a metaphor. It has real structure. It just exists in a different dimension of density. It's part of that multidimensional that we're talking about.
Mm. 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 Mm.
And the energetic heart is what I'm suggesting here, is that bridge to your larger self or your higher self, that
Yeah.
level of our wholeness that is operating in a different dimension outside of time and space as we know it. Big game intuition is the flow of information from the higher part of our divided wholeness, or self, from the energetic heart to the DNA. So I'm saying the energetic heart. We did experiments back in the 90s that to support what I'm saying here. So at the energetic heart level, that's what holds us together in our who we are in our wholeness.
That must be a very fascinating study, Rollin, you have been involved in. If I may ask you the last question here, and of course I can go on and on because there's so many new doors that you have opened for me. Here's the last question. You know, if you were to recommend a few practices for an individual to develop and strengthen the intuition, and especially you spoke about unlocal intuition, unlocal, yeah. So if you were to guide us with few practices that would help us to develop that intuition.
Yeah, I would say learn heart math techniques is the real answer. But there's about 8 core techniques in heart math that allow us to, in the moment, shift into coherence. And so most of the techniques, but by the way, I just add this, are not meditation techniques. This is not me. I'm not down on meditation. When we have a meditation technique, a heart-based meditation technique as well.
Yeah.
Hundreds and hundreds of studies now showing that heart-based approaches to meditation or whatever have all kinds of wonderful benefits for our own health, happiness, performance. But there's one of our techniques in particular, or a couple of them, are really about accessing our higher self, right? The information from our higher self. And freeze frame is one of those, and is the name of one of those. It's been around for many years. But they involve, like, the first step of most of the techniques is called heart focused breathing. So heart focused breathing is when you focus your attention in the area of the heart, the center of your chest, and imagine your breath is flowing in and out of your heart or chest area, breathing a little slower and deeper than you normally would. But you find that slower, deeper rhythm that's most comfortable. And just as a side note on that, we and many others have now published on this, that we actually have a resonant frequency within our physiology. So breathing at that slower, deeper rhythm, finding that rhythm that's comfortable, and it's going to be somewhere around a rhythm. It's 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out on the breath. It's going to be around that, but not necessarily exactly that for everyone. That now the heart and brain are more literally, measurably more synchronized. Their activity is working together because we're in different systems within the body are synchronizing together. So it's a highly efficient state that we call heart rhythm coherence. Now that, for some people that aren't familiar with this state yet, that's going to feel uncomfortable because it is a mismatch to their maladapted baseline.
Yeah.
But then the next step in most of the techniques is going to be something along the lines, depending upon the technique, of activating a regenerative feeling. Now, it can be a feeling of kindness, appreciation, or if it's in a social situation, a feeling of a genuine connection, right? But so at changing the emotional state is just as important, if not more important, than the breathing step. Because now we're starting to bring another type of coherence and alignment within our, I'll call it our energetic body. It's emotions that run the show within our body. It's so easy to prove in the lab. It's not our thinking, right? It's the emotions that kick up thoughts and stuff more than the other way around. So anyway, usually the second step is going to be something around it. Now, while you're doing the heart focused breathing, breathe that feeling of appreciation or gratitude or kindness or care, or it could be a feeling that you have at a special place in nature where you just have a feeling that you love to go. It could be as simple as the feeling you have when you come home and your pet greets you. That love we have for our dog, cat, whatever. And then from there, the different techniques go different places. Some would be that you can actually radiate those feelings, to yourself, to all the cells, or out to others, or to the earth itself. Or you might go the direction, as a good place in the context of intuition, is once you're coherent and you've gotten that deeper level of energetic alignment through breathing the feeling of appreciation or care, compassion, is then ask your heart. I mean, literally ask your heart, what is, depends on the question you have, but what would be the best choice to make in this decision I'm trying to make, right? And then from that more objective place of coherence, just kind of being breathe. In fact, you can just breathe the feeling of inner stillness, which is a good part of this exercise. And then really listening, just being quiet and listening for the answer from your heart. And for a lot of times it's going to be a feeling, because intuition often comes in our feelings. And sometimes it could actually be like, do this, right? A voice, that deeper inner voice. That usually comes later after some practice.
Yeah.
And then having the courage to follow through on it.
To follow through. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Because because the heart is speaking to us all the time, and well, not all the time, and finally it backs off if the mind is so stuck that it.
Yeah.
But it'll break through every now and then. We'll get these, what people call inspiration. I'm really going to do this thing. I'm going to start being nicer to my wife or my husband or a coworker.
Or to the
But
world.
inspiration has a timer on it.
Yeah.
Right. So if we don't follow through on it while we have that energy of the inspiration, you
would run out of that inspiration. Yeah. And I just love the question, Rollin. And once we've been able to activate the energetic energy within our heart, the question that I need to ask is, what is the best choice I can make in this situation? And then listen and then have the courage to follow through on that. Rollin, thank you so much. I think I could not have asked you more. And thank you so much for your generosity and offering this beautiful learning to me and to all our listeners. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.